here with me, Dr. Rebecca Mills, a lecturer in English and Communication and current Deputy Head of NCCR, and Dr. Julia Round, who is Associate Professor of English and Comic Studies. And Julia is going to tell us about her enthusiasm for comics and something about looking at comics from an academic perspective. So I think the first thing would be how? How did you get into comics in the first place?
How comics? I love it as a question. I think, like most people, this comes back to having something of a misspent youth, right? And I'm going to blame this almost entirely on my brother, who introduced me to his kind of comics reading, not really through superheroes, but kind of through the American comics that were coming out in the 90s that included things like Neil Gaiman's Sandman, Garth Ennis's Preacher, and they were kind of like sort of satires and genre fiction, kind of riffing off things that were out there already. And, you know, you may have heard of some of these through the TV adaptations that have happened more recently. They felt really kind of edgy to me, and they felt very sort of well written, very kind of complex stories, with some really mind-blowing art from both sides of the pond, really. So I just kind of went down this rabbit hole, really, of reading DC Vertigo comics and kind of spreading out from there. And as I got older and continued my descent into teenage gothdom, that kind of tied in with horror literature and things like that. And so after I did a lit degree, I kind of was looking for projects where I could kind of bring those interests together. And that's where I ended up, I guess.
And so that's when you kind of started looking at comics from a more academic perspective. What did you end up focusing on for that?
I think, like a lot of people coming off of their undergraduate degree or their masters, I was throwing everything I could at the comics projects to kind of see what was going to stick and what I wanted to do. And what I wanted to do, I think, when I started my PhD was kind of write this reclamation of why comics were literary and how they could kind of help us rethink or reimagine how we thought literary stories worked. That isn't really what I ended up doing, because looking at it now from a 47-year-old perspective, we're all aware that is way too wide to be any sort of project or study, right? So what basically happened was that I got led by my supervisor into focusing on a particular aspect of literary theory. So the PhD project became kind of looking at comics from a fantastic point of view, from a kind of mythic point of view, from a Gothic point of view, and it kind of honed down and down from that, really. And so I ended up targeting my work much more closely at what it was about comic storytelling that was really Gothic. Was it the kind of sort of the seen and unseen aspects of the page, the things that are hidden, the things that aren't shown? Was it the kind of way that narrators can be really unreliable to the point where you can have, you know, narration in boxes on the page that you don't know who's speaking, or characters can move from being characters in the story to narrating part of it or something outside of it? You know, is it the kind of tension that can kind of happen when you turn a page, you don't know what you're going to see next because you've got this visual medium? So lots of kind of different aspects of comic storytelling, and comics archetypes, even things like superheroes as kind of, you know, Gothic metaphors, things to kind of split identities and kind of often coming from traumatic places and stuff like that. So I started really picking apart comics from this kind of Gothic angle, and seeing where that took me, which was, yeah, quite a few interesting places, I think.
I mean, Batman and Gotham City comes to mind immediately in terms of Gothic, Bats, Dracula. But
Right.
I know kind of what you're doing isn't just kind of picking up these motifs, but looking at the kind of wider structural positioning of this medium.
But Gotham's a really good example of that anyway, right? Because Gotham is famously kind of been described as kind of New York City on the kind of darkest, most horrible day of the year, whereas Metropolis, where Superman lives, is kind of, you know, New York City in the height of summer, where everything feels safe and wonderful and clean and so on. So you've got that kind of meta split between how, you know, the comics industry has structured itself, because it's so American centric in that genre, because it's so focused on those big icons. You know, it can do some really interesting things with how we might understand them, and there's a kind of, you know, split there straight away, a kind of doubling that I think, you know, underpins that genre in loads of ways. And
your most recent work has been on Misty. Would you like to talk about Misty?
I would always like to talk about Misty as well, you know, Rebecca. I've got loads of Misties here, actually. Hey, look. So Misty, I think, is not where I thought I was going to end up, based on what I've just told you about the comics I read when I was younger. I didn't mention British girls comics then because I didn't read tons of them. And the comics I studied when I was 20, which was all the kind of, British writers, but in the American medium, kind of working with American genres. So Misty is this British girls comic that was published in the late 1970s. Only ran for a couple of years, 100 issues, 101 issues, and it kind of really just pushed the edges of what might be considered acceptable storytelling for girls, I think. And the reason I ended up writing about it was because although I didn't buy it when it came out, it was the 70s, I was one. It was something I found at like jumble sales and things like that when I was older, and I was kind of haunted by this memory of a particular story in it. And when I'd finished my Gothic book, I was looking for a new direction, and I thought, it'd be really nice if I could find that story. Having been really immersed in going to places like the British Library and where academic research could kind of take me. And, there was some funding then, so I could actually go to places and, dig into archives and go, hey, someone can find this. And I just got totally sucked into this comic. Like, it's got this kind of tendency towards kind of really vicious sort of cautionary tale stories, like these kind of twist in the tail stories where some protagonist will do something awful, like shoplift, and then get turned into a kind of closed dummy and be stuck there from all eternity, or, hear horrible noises from outside their house and then discover like the shadows of all the people in the town are kind of plotting to overthrow everybody. So it's got this real kind of twist in the tail thing. It's really unreassuring. It's really ambivalent. And it's also like really kind of just innovative and beautiful. That's the Shadows one I was talking about. It's got this kind of fantastic, sort of ethereal, curly artwork, and then it's got these real kind of contrast moments. This is, this girl being confronted by her shadow. And yeah, tons of really fantastic artists working on it. And despite being like quite notorious and quite well remembered, at least in the comic circles that I move in and the kind of middle-aged women's circles that I now move in, no one really knew that much about it, bar the idea that it was, launched as this kind of sister title to 2000 AD, and it was, led by Pat Mills. So I did this massive project, kind of just trying to uncover everything I could about it, which brought together all the stuff I was interested in on, children's literature and horror and comics. And yeah, it just became this, totally immersive thing, this really fulfilling thing that I have loved every minute of and continue to milk forever because everyone needs to know more Misty.
So if somebody was interested in, you said Misty issues themselves are quite hard to get hold of, right?
Not anymore though. So
No?
at the time I was writing, they were. Like I literally went up to the British Library and, spent a really hardcore, I think it was 4 days in the end, like just reading the whole, all the issues and making loads of notes and creating databases and details of the story and so on. But Rebellion Publishing own the IP for Misty, and they've brought out, I'm going to get this wrong probably, but 3 collected editions of past serial stories. They're producing new material in the form of things like the Misty Summer Special. There's been a kind of joint Halloween special with another defunct British comic called Scream. So there's loads of, it's actually had this kind of little revival. And, new work is coming out by new artists, by British creators like Gail Simone and Ali Fell and Letty Wilson and David Roach, and like really high quality stories in this kind of much more modern looking format now. It's all kind of looks like this, which I'm nostalgic for this, but this is also very cool.
Awesome. And if there was anything else in that kind of Gothic creepy girl field you'd recommend, what would that be?
Gothic creepy girl field. I think comics for Gothic creepy girls are very much still out there, very much going. I think if you're into the kind of more serious autobiographical end of stuff, there's stuff like Alison Bechdel's Fun Home out there. Looking on the British side, there's graphic novels like Una's Becoming Unbecoming. There's some really cool kind of manga inspired sort of high school stuff out there. And yeah, I think there's a lot of kind of options. There's superhero kind of stuff like Paper Girls or Lumberjanes. So yeah, loads of different places that people can kind of dip into these comics.
And where do you see your research going next? This is something I'm springing on you a bit.
Surprise question. I wish I knew. I have many, many ideas and many options. I really want to do a bit more work on British comics editors, the people who have not been spoken about perhaps as much as the writers and the artists, who are even harder to track down than the writers and the artists, because a lot of the work on these comics was not credited, but the editors kind of pulled all this stuff into shape and made a lot of changes to the material they got, because most of the stuff was being provided by freelance artists and freelance writers. So that's something I've been trying to get off the ground and continue to keep trying despite many failed bids and funding opportunities. I really want to do something on dreams in British girls comics. Dreams as kind of nightmares and prophecies and things like that. That seems like a kind of Gothic strand that I haven't really pursued as much as I could, but definitely could continue. I've just finished working on a co-edited collection on horror and comics that's going to be out shortly. So yeah, more work on horror and comics with a kind of British focus, I think, is where I want to keep going. And the children's horror comedy comics, which is something that no one is writing about. So if anyone watches this and feels like they should be doing that, please do, because I want to do it and I haven't got time. But there's a whole kind of series of titles like Shiver and Shake, and with characters like Frankenstein and things like that, riffing off of kind of horror cultures, but done in this sort of Beano children's comic style, that I would love to see people write about, because great writers and artists working on those as well.
Thank you so much. This has been really interesting. I feel we don't get to talk enough like this anymore. But yeah, we will have your contact details and links to your more recent work below. And yeah, thank you for joining.
Thanks, Rebecca.